His recent book is Yetis, Sasquatch, and Hairy Giants, one among many books that he's published and written over the years. Our co-hosts this week are Nicholas Redfern and Chris O'Brien. Now, David, how did you become interested in looking for strange creatures, specifically Yetis, Sasquatch, and hairy giants?
Well, I've always been interested in cryptozoology and just zoology and unknown animals. But when I was in high school, junior high school actually, in Durango, Colorado, Roger Patterson came to our high school, and it was 1967 or something, and gave a presentation. This was before he had taken, in fact, his famous Bluff Creek, California, Bigfoot footage. So he was really talking about stuff from his early book. His book, Do Abominable Snowmen of America Really Exist, was for sale, and I bought a copy, probably got him to autograph it even, and that got me going, really. From then on out, I bought other books on Bigfoot and UFOs and paranormal, and even books like Chariots of the Gods by Eric von Däniken, and now I'm the author myself of over 20 books. How about that?
Now, with regard to strange creatures, how did you do your investigation? Did you look up written information? Did you go on the scene, on site to talk to people? How did you do it?
Well, most of my research is done through books and the internet and interviewing people. With regard to Yetis and to Bigfoot to a point, I've gone on certain expeditions and trips myself. I've been to Nepal a number of times, and on those trips I've gone into Yeti areas. I've talked to Sherpas and other people who've claimed to have seen Yetis or taken photographs of footprints and things like that. And as my book on Yeti, Sasquatch, and hairy giants, much of that book towards the end is about really lesser-known Bigfoot and Skunk Ape reports throughout the United States, including Illinois and Arkansas, Florida, all over the eastern parts of the U.S. And one of my own personal investigations there was with the Dupont Monster, which is a well-known Bigfoot case in Seneca, Illinois, which is really just 60, 70 miles southwest of Chicago.
Now, in the course of this investigation, did you find anything that would lead you to believe that there were a fair number or any reasonable number of hoaxes being perpetrated here?
I certainly think that there are Bigfoot hoaxes being, perpetrated, and particularly when you go on the internet and look at some of the photos and video footage there, it's clear that a lot of it's actually a hoax. And it's finding, the truth that's out there, shall we say. It's not my opinion, though, that, people who report Bigfoot encounters, Skunk Ape encounters, or Yeti encounters for that matter, are fakers or people who are making up stories for their own, for themselves or something. Most Bigfoot stories that I've come across seem to be genuine, and mainly because the people have no real reason to be deceptive. I've found really that people are reluctant to tell their stories about Bigfoot, largely because they think that their friends and others won't believe them. And it makes them look stupid and kind of foolish, kind of dumb. Oh, you saw Bigfoot, or this or that happened. And so in my mind, the people who actually come out and say, yeah, this is what I saw, I mean, they're bucking the trend and actually, they're being brave by saying, yeah, I know what I saw and this is what happened to me.
Now let's look at the background of the legends of strange creatures. Now, at the beginning of the book, you're talking about the giants in the Bible and elsewhere. So before we see if there's any connection, what were these giants all about?
Those stories of giants and wild men of yore, Bigfoot, of course, it's often said to be 8, 9, 10, 12 feet tall, making them, of course, literal giants. We get many stories of giants, like from the Bible, the famous story of David and Goliath, of course, the sons of God, Anakim and Nephilim and things like that. They were apparently 10, 12 feet tall. stories of giants have always fascinated me, and it's my belief that people were taller in ancient times, and we've been getting shorter over the years. But my research there with the giants was really to bring out the early stories of wild men. And they're often giants too, and that these guys who are living on the edge of civilization, they're humans, but they're not completely human. Cavemen, as you might say, Neanderthals, perhaps. In some cases, they're just perhaps crazy people who've been outcast from society and now live deep in the woods without clothing, sort of the village idiot kind of a thing. And, I mean, this is a real phenomenon. We, particularly in Europe, in the Middle Ages, stories of wild men were very common. And the idea that some of these guys were, of course, unusually tall, like Bigfoot. And the big question there with wild men and hairy giants, in a sense, is whether they're really humans or whether they're these ape men, which is kind of what Sasquatch and Yetis appear to be. They're humans in a sense, but very hairy. They're stronger than us. In my book, I'm probably getting a little bit ahead of myself here, but yeah, there's even stories of Sasquatch and Yetis mating with humans, both with males and female humans, mating with male and female Yetis and Bigfoot.
We heard about in the Bible about giants mating with human women, quote unquote, but wouldn't it also be kind of unusual here about the fact that I got the impression that the giants of old were fairly advanced beings, but then we're talking about Neanderthals and other primitive beings. So isn't there some kind of contradiction or line of demarcation here?
Well, sure, and that's a good point. Yeah, the supposed sons of God who were giants, yeah, they were then advanced beings rather than hairy ape men or something. And in fact, you could argue that these guys, spaceships and all kinds of advanced technology. And so those kind of giants and just other human giants. And I even at the end of that chapter, I run through even some of the modern giants and giantesses that we know about and have been measured. And part of my study with that was to look at people, total humans, who were just unusually tall, but were well proportioned.
Yeah, I mean, having read the book, David, I thought it was just a great addition, not least for the one reason being the huge size of the book for the listeners. It's almost 400 pages long and has some excellent and very little-known artwork contained in the book, particularly a lot of color photographs. I think that's one of the things that's going to greatly appeal to people. But one of the things that's kind of come up when Gene was talking, was this, I won't say contradiction, but the angle that some of these creatures in history, come across as very intelligent and advanced, others less so. And I was wondering, from your perspective and the research you've done, do you feel that creatures like Bigfoot, the Yeti, etc., need to be classed separately until we understand what they are, rather than all being offshoots of the same creature, if you like? In other words, do you think we could be actually looking at several different types of mystery ape?
Yes, sure. No, I very much agree with that. And even Yetis, there are 3 or 4 different types of Yetis, different colors, different sizes. There's a smaller one that's only 4 or 5 feet tall. I mean, they're actually a little bit smaller than a human. I think that the ones like the orang penyek in Sumatra and parts of Malaysia, this is also probably a slightly different species, more akin to an orangutan. Particularly with, say, Bigfoot in North America, the most famous stories are really from the Pacific Northwest, and the Bigfoot there is really probably the largest of all of these creatures, it seems. And these guys are genuinely huge and giants by that kind of reckoning, where you could easily encounter some being that's 9, 10 feet tall. When you look at more the skunk apes of the southern states and in the swamps, they're clearly smaller animals and more about the size of a human. You have different colors of fur. Reddish-brown is often, the most common color that they're said to be, but they can be very dark, even grayish. And then you have the stories, which I find particularly fascinating, of these white-haired Bigfoots that are commonly seen. And they appear to be some kind of elderly, cast-out Bigfoot who's been kind of like lions do this, where the younger lions force the old lions out of the pride, and they have to become like a rogue lion hunting for themselves. And it even appears that this happens with Bigfoot. And some of the encounters, I believe, of some of the Bigfoot who really do range close to civilization, start dumpster diving and things like that, are these older rogue Bigfoot, and they're often, pure white. This one that was seen recently in North Carolina was on the news. This was in June, I guess it was, and all the major news networks carried this. And it was this mountain man up in the hills of North Carolina, and he called the police, claiming 2 close encounters with what he described as a 10-foot-tall, white-haired Bigfoot. And curiously with that, he claimed that Bigfoot had 6 fingers on each hand. And that goes back to the Bible, which is curious, where some of the Philistines and these giants of the Bible, they were also said to have 6 fingers on each hand. How about that?
And I guess kind of on the angle of what these creatures are. I mean, I think one of the themes that runs through many of these accounts is that these creatures are highly elusive, whether it's in the Himalayas, in the Pacific Northwest, in Europe. And I wondered if you felt the image of these creatures just being sort of dumb animals that have managed to hide from society conveniently for so long is valid, or do you think the fact that we're still looking for them suggests that mentally, in some respects at least, they might be highly evolved, and that has some bearing on the fact that we're still scratching our heads while they're still running around doing their thing?
Well, right. I think it's both those in a sense. They are highly evolved, I believe, in that their hearing and sight and sense of smell are very, very keen. They're nocturnal. They avoid humans at all costs, virtually. They do. What I found in my book as I was researching it, particularly in all the things in the eastern United States, was that these skunk apes, these Bigfoot Sasquatch guys, the Grassman, that they do live within areas that are relatively fairly inhabited and populated. I think even my own impression originally was that Bigfoot and Yeti lived in the most remote mountain forests, and I mean, gosh, there's up in British Columbia and Washington State and Northern California even, there's huge, vast forests, massive wilderness areas where all kinds of unknown creatures could live. But when you start thinking that just swamps and forests in Illinois and New Jersey and Pennsylvania, North Carolina can also have these creatures, that's where you start to really sort of raise an eyebrow and think, wow, are there really these large unknown animals, these ape men, living in such close proximity to humans and civilization? And what I've come to the conclusion is that yes, they are, and they're practically in your backyard. They're sneaking around late at night. They take the most darkest little ravines and river streams, to get to whatever, some orchard where they want to pick peaches. And that was one of the stories in my book. To even, like I say, dumpster diving, or sometimes they're just crossing a road from one side of a swamp to another and someone on late at night is coming down that highway and catches a Bigfoot in the headlights kind of thing. And it all happens very quickly. People often, they're startled. They don't know what they've seen. They will often call the police, or they tell their parents, or they suddenly turn around and go to the police department, tell this amazing story of what's all happened to them, and for a day or two, it's on the local radio station, even gets into the newspaper, and then everybody forgets about it again.
And do you think these creatures are more ape than human, or the other way around, or is it somewhere in between, do you think?
That the apes are human?
No.
What? I didn't get that.
Okay. Do you think these creatures are more ape than human, or more, I guess, like primitive humans than ape, or is it somewhere in between?
Well, somewhere in between, but they're very similar to humans, of course, and people, when they first see them, often mistake them for a human, except they're not wearing any clothes, they're large, they hairy, of course, and they look like monsters, but still have this human semblance. Mm-hmm. When you look at the genetics of apes, and I'm not some expert on apes, really, but I certainly looked into it a little bit in my research, but orangutans are one chromosome away from being a human. And that one chromosome is significant, but orangutans and humans, in theory, could mate and create some sort of half-breed human orangutan.
Yeah, that's one of the more interesting elements, I guess, in one sense of the word, of your book, David, is some very interesting stories, claims by people who say they've been abducted, both male and female, that they've been abducted by Bigfoots. And the one story that was particularly striking, I believe, was the woman, I think, in Russia who actually mated with a Bigfoot and had a son. Do you want to talk about that? That's a fascinating story.
Well, right, and that was in Dagestan, and in Mongolia, Central Asia, the Russian Republic areas, typically the Yetis there are known as an Almas, Almas, or some derivative of that, and it was there was, during World War II, when all kinds of unusual things were going on, they realized that there was this family that was living in Dagestan, and they had captured a woman, a female Bigfoot, I should say, an Almas, and it was kept in this village as a captive, but they somehow managed to tame this female Bigfoot, and it actually married somebody. Zana was the name they gave her. She was unable to speak, but she did have several sons. And in the 1950s, the Soviets actually did some studies with them, and there's a photograph in my book of a guy named Quit from 1954, and he's apparently some kind of half-human, half-Alma's Bigfoot character, and, he was just a normal villager in this little town. I don't think he went out and became a rocket scientist or a doctor or anything like that. But, there's other stories like that, too. I've got photos in the book of a very strange woman in Brazil who also looks like a part human, part ape woman. And whatever happened to her, we don't really know. In Nepal, there's a very famous story which happened in the 1920s of a Sherpa gal named Noma Dingma, and she was in a remote yak pasture watching her yaks when she was allegedly abducted by a Yeti. And you have this whole story of a Yeti Lonely Hearts Club kind of a thing, where this lonely Yeti finds what is really, in a sense, sort of a lonely Sherpa girl, although she's not a willing captive of this Yeti. But he takes her up to a cave up in the mountains. And in Nepal, too, is what particularly with Nepal and Sikkim and Bhutan and other areas of the Himalayas and kind of eastern Tibet, you have these steep mountains and icy passes and whatnot, but you have deep ravines and river areas like the Aran Valley. And there's literally just within several thousand feet and within a few miles, this tremendous eco-range of deep forest and even literally jungle, where then also snow-capped peaks and icy passes and things like that. So with her, she was then taken, rather than go up higher in the mountains to some icy snow cave, they're taken down into these river valleys that are deep, and they're heavily forested. And then there's caves there. She claimed, for years she lived with this Yeti. He would turn over, this is what she claimed, giant rocks in the streams and things. And under those rocks there would be all these little frogs and fishes, and he would gather them up and they would eat them. They lived this hunter-gathering existence. They slept in this cave. She described it too as, she was really an unwilling wife of this Yeti. But over time, cold nights and things like that, yes, they began having sex. And she ultimately had a child by this Yeti. The story then, and there's several stories similar to this in both Bhutan and in Nepal, where they have a child, and there's another story similar where a man is kidnapped by a female Yeti, a Sherpa. They also have a child together. But over several years of being a captive of this Yeti, they devise a way to escape, and it's not easy. But somehow they're able, when there's a chance, to run, get across a big ravine or a stream, kick off a log or something that gives them access, and somehow escape back to their village, which isn't really that far, but still in those steep, remote mountains, can be a several-day hike over a mountain pass. Well, what happens in each of these stories is the Yeti husband or wife, in this case, comes back to the village or shows this half-baby, half-Yeti, half-human, half-Yeti baby, but then it tears that baby up and kills it right in front of the father or the mother that's a human, ripping its arms and legs off, just tearing it into pieces, and then leaving. In some cases, too, the villagers hunted down one of these Yetis and killed it because it was coming every night to this village where it was, knew that its kidnapped ex-wife was living. That woman, Noma Dingma, who was very famous in Nepal, her life was shattered by being kidnapped by a Yeti, basically. And she entered a Buddhist monastery and lived the last of her life as a Buddhist nun. There's also a famous story, too, about in Canada of a guy, a Canadian, back in the 1920s, and he was kidnapped as well by a family of Yetis and held captive only for a few days. But they, too, seemed to want him to marry this Yeti, female young Yeti that was there. And that's a famous story. You probably know that one, Nick.
Yeah, there's a lot of stories like this, where you get human interaction with these creatures. And that's one of the things that fascinates me, is that it makes me, suspect at least, that there's a connection between us and them. You don't necessarily see Bigfoot having, a fascination with, wolves or bears or whatever, but they seem to be fascinated with people, which somehow suggests that, on some level, at least in my mind, that there's, I guess, like a physical connection or a species connection somehow.
They are, yeah. I totally agree with you. They are fascinated by humans. They don't have fire. And this is one of the things that comes up continually with people who do interact with Yetis, Almas, Bigfoot, is that, they live in caves and these nests they use tools and things. They do communicate somehow with clicks and sounds and things, but they're afraid of fire. Campfire will keep them away. They can't speak as we can, but they want to. They see humans as something that they wish they could attain. We have these special skills of speaking and interaction. We're wearing clothes and things. One of the stories too in Nepal is that the Yetis want to imitate humans. A famous story that's told in both Bhutan and Nepal is of some Yetis that are annoying some remote village. And so what the villagers do to get rid of them, and they know the Yetis are watching them, they have a big festival, and they make a big cauldron of beer, and they drink the beer, and they're getting drunk, and they're dancing. And then what they did was grab their machetes, these kukris are called in Nepal, these big sort of knife swords. They're really big. They're for chopping woods and stuff. And then they pretended to attack each other, and they were hacking each other with these kukris, but they were just doing it pretend. And then they left their kukris, these swords, on the ground, and there was still plenty of beer, and they all went to bed.
It sounds like they're just like any normal human, as a matter of fact. Now, call me dumb about all this stuff, David, and lots of people call me that. All right, I'm not understanding the separation here or the connection between the giants of old in biblical times that were highly advanced people and the Sasquatch, Yetis, whatever you're talking about here, that seem to be very primitive, barely in the caveman stage. So educate me once again.
Well, the first part of the book, the very first chapter, is about giants, and then I go on to wild hairy men. But because Yetis and Sasquatch are often very tall, yeah, in my mind, they fit into the category of giants. Not all Bigfoot are giants or Yetis. Some and skunk apes, particularly, they can only be, sometimes they're only 5 feet tall or so. But so, yeah, my early chapter was a discussion and exploration of giants. And, as I talk about it in there, many giants of yore they are humans. They're not Yetis. They're not Bigfoot. They're human beings who are unusually tall. Apparently they did have 6 fingers on each hand. But yeah, they're humans with, they talk, they carry swords, they wear clothes, they can deal with fire, they can be very smart. There's nothing really that holds them back as some animal or something.
Continue, and then I want to ask you a question. Go ahead.
Okay, but then there's other giants, and they apparently appear to not really be fully human. They're some kind of ape men, and they're giants too. And apparently some of them also have 6 fingers on each hand. So you have to wonder a little bit if some of the giants, say like Goliath or somebody, or some of these guys who allegedly had 6, fingers or 6 toes, whether they were perhaps part human and part Sasquatch or something like that, or rather, I think, in many cases, human beings, particularly in the ancient time, everything was bigger back then. And human beings 10, 20,000 years ago were taller than us. They were bigger, but they were humans. They weren't Bigfoot. They weren't ape men. They're human beings.
Okay, so therefore, would that mean that they were the normal-sized people and we are the little people? Maybe somewhere along the line, the race, for whatever reason, interbreeding, whatever, they developed a species that was much smaller and didn't live as long. Maybe that's another issue, too. These giants supposedly lived hundreds of years, and look what we have, 20 and then some?
Yes, right. And that is one of the stories that these ancient giants, like the biblical ones, yeah, they lived hundreds of years. Adam, too. Sometimes they're said to be, gigantically huge and tall, 40 feet, 50 feet tall or something. There's Adam's Peak with Adam's footprint in Sri Lanka, and it's a giant footprint of a person who would be, 30 feet tall or something. I've been there and seen it. And if you are a pilgrim and you go there, and Muslims and Buddhists and Hindus and Christians all go to that mountain to see this footprint, and they, in many cases, actually believe it's a footprint of some 40-foot tall, super ancestor of mankind. I'm personally not so sure about that myself. It's probably more just some bizarre natural formation that looks like a footprint, and I've seen it. But yes, I think that that in ancient times, particularly, as I said, before the last ice age, everything was bigger. There were giant insects. There were woolly mammoths running around. Bears were bigger. Saber-toothed cats and lions, they were all bigger. Cattle were bigger, and bison. And just in general, everything was much bigger. But then in the last cataclysmic change, which was really the end of that last ice age, was mass extinctions. Many of the giant animals were destroyed. Everything got a little bit smaller, and including humans. And so here we are today. Really, humans have been getting shorter throughout history, and the main reason for that is warfare. War is mankind's favorite sport. In ancient times, it's what they did for fun. And it was much like a football team. You put the big guys up front, and they all get killed. So wars basically make people shorter because the tall guys all go to war, and they all get killed.
We kill the best and the brightest, and we bring back the people who maybe aren't quite as smart and aren't quite as tall and don't live quite as long. We leave them behind.
Well, it would be like that. In the last 100 years or so, largely because of better nutrition, people have been getting taller. But I think that's just in the most recent time, and it's because of warfare is not so much the big guys up front anymore. It's more technologically done, and people do have better health care, nutrition, and whatnot, and so people are now getting a little bit taller. But people really, in my mind, were much taller in ancient times. Now, another thing along that is that it seems that people in ancient times, too, interacted more with these ape men. That Sasquatch, Yetis, Almas, the Skunk Apes and whatnot, even though I think for those, and they're animals who want to stay clear of humans largely, but it may be that in those ancient times there was more interaction, less fear, and perhaps even, bizarrely, also some kind of intermarriage there. You have strange stories of even battles fought between hairy ape men and things like that. There was a strange one that I have in the book that goes back to Alexander's army and a strange battle they fought somewhere in Western India with these people who they describe as kind of ape men and hairy. Although these guys also did have arrows and some weapons and things. So you almost wonder if sort of that certain Yeti, ape men, Sasquatch were used by humans as captives, as even guards or soldiers. There's a famous story in India of Hanuman, who is Rama's buddy, and he's this ape man. But he does all kinds of, he's a hero, does all kinds of things for Rama, helps Rama get his captured wife back. They do all these things. In the more modern mythology there, where we have our Star Wars movies, and Han Solo's big buddy is this Wookiee, hairy ape man Chewbacca guy who co-pilots his spaceship with him. But Chewbacca can't talk.
Well, he kind of talks, but he talks in another language, though. Sort of, more or less. It sounds like gibberish to me, but what do I know about Star Wars?
And, after a few drinks in the space bar, he might find, some of the women there looking pretty good. I don't know.
I've got a question for you, David. It's one that I am constantly asked whenever the subject of Sasquatch, Yetis, and hairy giants comes up is if there's so many of these things out there, I mean, I think we've got them reported in 49 of 50 states, for instance, just in this country. They're spread all over the world. You have all these reports. You have all these legends, stories, some more compelling than others. Why isn't there any physical evidence that is left behind? Why don't we find dead ones, carcasses, skeletal remains, physical evidence that would prove conclusively that these creatures exist? There just seems to be, it's devoid of any real physical evidence, although you do have a couple of very intriguing photographs in your book, and there are some relics, I think, in the Far East. But how do you answer the skeptical, the first skeptical question that generally comes up is, how come we can't find any of these things, remains?
And that's a really good question. I think one of the most common one. It's why aren't hikers up in Washington State or something hiking down the trail and finding a dead Bigfoot lying there, and then they'd whip out their cell phones, take a lot of good pictures, call the rangers, chopper it out, and it'd be at the Smithsonian or something. And here's why that doesn't occur. I mean, if you're walking down the trail in Washington State or British Columbia, you're not ever going to see a dead Bigfoot. I've hiked a lot, and I'm from the Pacific Northwest, actually. I went to high school in Montana, and I've hiked a lot in the Himalayas as well. And I can tell you, in all my time of hiking, I've never walked down the trail and found a dead deer, a dead bear, dead mountain lion. I've never found a dead badger. I mean, you just don't really see that kind of thing. Bears must die out in the woods somewhere, and and it may well be some hikers have occasionally just somehow, found a dead bear, but it doesn't really happen. And things decay quickly. If some old Bigfoot died in some heavily bushy ravine, that's kind of where they live. Yeah, he's not going to become a fossil. His body will decay and really turn to dust pretty quick. I mean, just in a matter of days. But it's certainly possible that somebody could encounter a skeleton or something like that. Now, as far as that goes, and having some kind of a body or a relic, those things do exist. There are mummified Yeti hands and scalps. I've seen them. They're in the Himalayas. Some of them have been stolen, in fact. Edmond Hillary, one of the first guys to climb Mount Everest with the Sherpa Tenzing Norgay, he was involved himself in having the hair of one of these Yeti scalps analyzed. And it was inconclusive. Some scientists said, oh, well, this is, the hair was red, and they thought it was from a sero, which is a kind of a red-haired goat that lives in Tibet. But other studies of it as well were inconclusive, and they said, yeah, we cannot identify this. That's one of the most important things that's been going on in Sumatra and Malaysia, also in Bhutan at this point, where British teams, particularly for some reason the British are keen on this, and the British have always, like you, Nick, they're into mystery animals and the unexplained. So they want proof, and trying to get hair samples and blood samples from these things is key. And that's exactly what they're doing. The kind of traps that I'm aware of that people use, who are basically these monster hunters trying to get hair of Bigfoot and some blood, is to set up a chicken, and you put nails and with wood and something that they want to grab. And the idea is that when they're grabbing a chicken off of a tree or some pole that you've put up, that you're able they scratch themselves. And what happens is they leave some hair and blood on these nails and spikes that you put there, and that's what you can use. Then you can study that hair and ideally that blood, and that's what they've done. And they've basically found hair samples that they can't identify from any known animal, and that would basically be evidence of a sort that yes, there is an unknown animal out there. He is some kind of ape man. He's got red hair. He's 8 feet tall, he's this, he's that. And so you're finding that evidence. Now, on top of all that, we have some of the really strange stories of actual bodies, including the Minnesota Iceman that was exhibited for some years, Ivan T. Sanderson, and Bernard Heuvelmans, the famous Belgian cryptozoologist. They both studied the Iceman for a couple of days up in Minnesota. He's encased in ice, but they both concluded that this Iceman was real, that it wasn't some wax dummy or some kind of Hollywood model frozen, that it was completely real, and that the hair on it, and even with the Iceman, he had a penis that they could look at, and other parts. He'd been shot through the head, and it wasn't until the FBI got involved in that case, and because he had been shot, and that was one of the things with the Minnesota Iceman, he had taken a bullet through one eye, and so his one eye was missing because a bullet had entered the head. So the FBI at one point wanted to investigate it to see if some murder had taken place in Minnesota or wherever the Minnesota Iceman was originally from. And that's when he disappeared. And at that point, the Minnesota Iceman vanished, and we don't know what happened to it. It's thought now that the Minnesota Iceman came from Southeast Asia and from even Vietnam. And there's a special park in Vietnam, the high mountains there along the Cambodian border, and it is known as a place for the Vietnamese Bigfoot or wild man, and they think it might have come from there.
Now, I'm going to avoid the jokes, David, about the Iceman cometh and goeth, because I think people are going to say that's pathetic humor. Okay, so knowing this, that it's so hard to get this evidence, except for occasionally we have these fossil or these skeletal remains, where are they? Is there no place around the world where all this evidence is collected so scientists can look it over and see what's going on?
Well, now that's another question here, and I didn't include this story in my book, actually, but as an archaeologist, and basically, most of my research is archaeological rather than cryptozoological, and in my archaeological research, I've finally come to the conclusion over time that there genuinely are archaeological cover-ups, and that things are suppressed, evidence comes out that would sort of change history in one way or another, and powers that be, for various reasons, decide to suppress evidence. I've come to the conclusion that with Bigfoot, there is something like that also going on, that even I've been told by other people who've been very close to Bigfoot areas and studied them over time, that local rangers and other wildlife officials have kind of, with a wink, acknowledged that these critters are out there, that they know about them. They're sort of quasi-protected in that sense. Rangers will sometimes tell people who they think are out there hunting for Bigfoot that they shouldn't be shooting at these, hairy man-apes that they might see.
David, this is an unofficial cover-up. Is there an official cover-up? Is there anything that we could basically...
Well, right. I mean, I think it's both. There is an unofficial cover-up where the local rangers and stuff just don't want to get involved. It's a giant can of worms they don't want to open. They don't want people shooting Bigfoot, in their part of the forest, and actually tell them, not to do it. But here's a story that I thought was very interesting. And as I said, I did not include it in the book and came across it, fairly recently, but it was particularly fascinating to me. I was on the internet, and it was a forum talking about exactly this, evidence for Bigfoot, why there's not. And a guy was on the forum, basically gave this story, and that it was after Mount St. Helens blew up in Oregon in, was it 1982 or something? What happened there on one side of Mount St. Helens, and this is a very famous Bigfoot area, and a number of the most famous Bigfoot incidents happened around there. But when the mountain blew up, this giant wave of super hot, they call it pyroclastic flow of just gas and fire and lava, and it pours down the mountain as the blast from an explosion, and it totally destroys everything in its wake, and animals are fried to a crisp, and instantly And that after all this happened, what this man was claiming was that he saw a cleanup operation on one side of Mount St. Helens involving the Army. They had helicopters and things, and that they were removing all of these burned, dead animals from the area, which included deer and bear. And he claimed that he saw them also putting dead Sasquatch onto helicopters who had also been destroyed and burned, killed in this pyroclastic flow, and that they were also loading them onto these helicopters and taking them, away to someplace. And that here were officials, he was claiming, were involved. It's literally the government, and that they have these bodies of these burned Bigfoot and stuff. What's really fascinating with that, where you get into the Minnesota Iceman, the supposed burned bodies of Bigfoot from Oregon and stuff like that, is that here now the American government actually has got, if not a living Bigfoot, they've got some dead ones.
I want to get into this more detail, David. Okay, it is claimed. So how do we verify the claim?
Boy, I don't know. I don't think we can. We would, at some point, I think what would happen, and hopefully it wouldn't be a hoax, like was it last year, was a famous hoax where they had these guys in Georgia, and they were policemen, in fact, claimed that they had, shot Bigfoot. No, they had him in a freezer. There was a big publicity conference and everything for it. The news was there. And supposedly some Indiana businessman had paid $40,000 or something for this dead Bigfoot, and so money had changed hands and everything, and it was all a hoax. And it came down, people were embarrassed, the silly season of the news, got a story for a day or two. But what would eventually happen, and I think that's what's interesting about this story in June from North Carolina, where this mountain man basically, had a confrontation with this 10-foot-tall, white-haired Bigfoot on his property in North Carolina. The police got involved. The police also acknowledged that there had been other reports of Bigfoot there. This mountain man had no reason to just make up stories like this. That, to me, it totally seemed credible. But one of the things he didn't have was a cell phone or a camera. Now, if his teenage daughter had been with him, she would have immediately whipped a camera out of her pocket, as every teenager has now, and taken video footage. And broad daylight of this, 10-foot-tall Bigfoot, supposedly. And that's what's happening now, is that people have cameras. Everybody is carrying a cell phone camera with them all the time. Every, thing that happens to them, they're able to video it. What's also happening, and I talk about this in my book as well, is they're now coming out with these very affordable wildlife cameras that are fixed. And you put them on a tree or something like that and walk away and then come back a few days later, and it will take photos of, the wildlife along the trail where you've put it. And people are doing this. You can now buy them through catalogs of National Geographic and stuff. They're very affordable, these cameras, and this is a new thing. But when people set up these cameras, and this happened a year ago in Kentucky, where this guy put a camera like that in his backyard, and he thought, I'll get some cute pictures of raccoons and things like that. And then when he looked at the pictures on his camera, there was this gorilla sitting in this, garden in this remote rural area of Kentucky. He then showed it to wildlife experts, and he said, can you explain this? What animal is this? And of course, they couldn't explain it. And they said, well, it looks like there's a gorilla, in your backyard. But of course, there are no gorillas around here, so we can't explain this. And this also got a lot of attention. That photo is in my book, and it was called The Backyard Bigfoot. This is all kind of new. And what's new about it is that people have cameras all the time. And what's happening is we're getting many, many more pictures of Bigfoot now. There's also video cameras. There's interesting footage that came out of Poland also about a year ago. And they filmed this Bigfoot that in this remote mountain area, and the footage is on the internet. It's interesting to watch. It's daylight footage. And as you watch it, I mean, either it's a man in a Bigfoot costume running around in this remote mountain area of Poland, or it's some kind of hairy ape man.
Of course, if you see something from a distance, how do you know it's not just trying to create some kind of Hollywood-style effect with a guy in a suit?
Well, right. And, I mean, this is what happens with a lot of the Bigfoot photos and video footage that's coming out now. The same with some of the relics, like the Yeti scalp and other stuff like that that's in monasteries in Nepal and whatnot. And that's it. I mean, either it's a real Bigfoot, Sasquatch, or Yeti in these photos, or the scalp or the hand, or they're real, or, I mean, someone is faking it. And in my mind, there are some fakes. There's no doubt about that. But as I've researched it, yeah, the overwhelming evidence to me is that it's real and that people are not faking it. And except in a few cases, it's really not worthwhile for people to fake this stuff and photos, because it really, all it does is bring them ridicule, and their friends start to question their judgment and think that, you know, they're stupid or are dumb. Yeah, you really think you saw Bigfoot? Well, you know, you're an idiot. But a lot of people will stand their ground and say, well, maybe I'm an idiot, but I know what I saw. What most people explain of Yetis, and in fact, the famous mountaineer, Reinhold Messner from Austria, he's one of the greatest mountaineers in the world. He wrote a book called My Quest for the Yeti. And because he's really probably the world's most famous mountaineer, this book was published by major publishers, different languages. I've got copies of it. It's an interesting read. But in that book, he largely concludes that the Yeti of the Himalayas and Tibet and whatnot is actually a bear. I'd love to ask Nick a question or two myself. And, you know, Nick, I've always loved your books and your Three Men, Search of Monsters and all that. You're a man after my own heart, sort of traveling there in search of monsters and having a good time while you do it with your friends. In your encounters, you know, and I guess you ranged across America. I mean, have you had any close encounters with hairy ape men?
Well, I've had a few weird experiences. I mean, one of the things that doesn't get talked about a lot within Bigfoot research circles, but I think it's a valid area of research, is a phenomenon that become known as Bigfoot teepees, which sounds kind of strange, but in areas where we get a lot of Bigfoot reports, we get a lot of sightings and discoveries of these curious structures where very large, in some cases, branches have been literally wrenched off trees and placed into pyramid-type formations. And this can be, 20, 30 miles deep into the woods. And they look very, very curious. And as I said, there's no attempt to saw the wood. It looks like something very, very strong and large. You just wrench these branches off, place them into these formations. And wherever you get Bigfoot reports, typically at some point, you get these curious structures. And of course, some people, speculate as to what they are. There are theories that they're sort of like a territorial marker or boundary that these creatures put up, I guess to warn or attract others of their kind. And I've actually stumbled quite literally across a number of these in areas of high Bigfoot activity over the years. And I think for me, that's, it's kind of like an eerie feeling when you come across these formations and you feel like you've almost gone from the hunter to the hunted, and you get this, I guess, sort of very weird sensation of being watched. Now, whether that's valid or not, or we just assume we're being watched, is a big question. But I've had a number of experiences like that, and it sort of makes me realize that this is a real, even though it's a strange phenomenon, it's a very elusive one. It's a very real one as well. And I think when you actually stumble across these things yourself, then you begin to realize that it's, something's going on, and it's in our midst, and in some respects almost toying with us as well.
I think that's a really good point. And from my limited experience and talking to people, yeah, there's a point where the hunter becomes the hunted in these kind of things. And as you get too close to, say, a Bigfoot nest or lair or wherever they are, or even just following them somehow along in a forest, they will warn you. and they do things like,
oh boy, do they?
They'll just rip a giant tree up or break, some superhuman kind of strength too. And these things are incredibly strong. And you suddenly see in front of you a tree just be snapped in half or something, and there's a big crack, and a tree falls down towards you or something. And it's frightening, and it's something's going on, and you're in thick bush and forest, but you realize that something very big, it's watching you, it knows where you are, and it doesn't want you there. And you are frightened and you leave if you're smart.
Yeah.
I mean, Chris, stuff like this happened to you, hasn't it?
Yeah. It's an interesting story. I'll try to make it brief, but a friend of mine and I wanted to climb around on the, up Mount Shasta in the early spring. We went up a logging road, had to dig through some drifts that had drifted over the top part of the road up near the base of the mountain. We were obviously the first people up there to, that spring. This would have been May 1979, and we encountered this real impenetrable hedge that I think was either mountain huckleberry or some sort of madrona, super tough, resilient alpine vegetation that was in an impenetrable hedge. And of course, in many stories, one of the first things that people notice is a very foul smell. This smelled like a human skunk is the only way I could describe it. It was really noxious. And we heard this roar. Very hard to describe it, kind of a cross between a lion's roar, an elephant trumpeting, and a angry locomotive or something. It was just ear-splittingly loud. And we heard something coming through this 8 foot high hedge, and it was crashing through this impenetrable hedge at us. And boy, I tell you, that's probably the most frightening experience I've ever had in my life. We ran down that hill so fast, I don't even remember how we did it. But this is, based on my limited research in this area, this is a fairly common occurrence. We had 2 years ago in the San Luis Valley, we had 2 hunters that were going up Costilla Canyon just below the border with New Mexico in Colorado, and they were chased away by a Bigfoot that was banging a big stick on the ground and throwing, tree parts at them and chased them away from this particular area they were going up to go hunting in. And one of the things that one of our forum listeners, radio listeners and forum participants asked about is the paranormal aspect of Bigfoot. There's a very interesting story in Andrew Colvin's book, Mothman's Photographer 2, where he quotes John Keel, who had a witness that saw a Bigfoot pulling a second Bigfoot literally out of the ground without disturbing the soil, almost like they were not fully manifest or something. There's other accounts of Bigfoot seemingly disappearing in front of witnesses. There's other suggestions in some stories that they're able to somehow teleport. There's also a psychic component. Some people have encountered these creatures and felt some sort of psychic link with the creature. Do you care to comment on that? If we're dealing, I know you think that this is a real cryptozoological creature, but there is a body of anecdotal evidence that suggests that maybe something also paranormal, in that these creatures may have some sort of abilities to blink in and blink out.
Well, that is a fascinating area of research when it comes to Bigfoot is like you're saying, this paranormal aspect or the interdimensional critters. There's a few stories that link UFOs with Bigfoot. And those are, I think, particularly interesting. I've not really found that those stories are so widespread. They seem to only be a few. It's something I've asked people, too, particularly people who've had a number of close encounters with a Bigfoot, including farmers, especially in Illinois and other areas of the Midwest where there's certain areas like around Seneca, Illinois, where it's just known that these Bigfoot live, and people encounter them all the time. There's a Lover's Lane area there where Bigfoot would peer into the backseat of cars and things like that. It actually became a very famous story in the Chicago Tribune back in 2003. But when I've asked people, too, about, like, are they some kind of interdimensional creature? Do they have these paranormal powers? The people I've talked to have overwhelmingly told me that they're animals. They are like a gorilla, like an ape. They act like them. They throw rocks. They have to eat food. They're interested in humans, and they have such a keen sense of smell that they can smell sex. They can smell women who are menstruating, or and just the flow of hormones and things like that. And that's one of the famous stories that happened at Dupont because of this Lover's Lane, is that, yeah, Bigfoot would be attracted to these cars where people were making out or having sex and wanted to see what was going on. And he could smell it. So I don't know. And my own belief, and largely the way I come at it in my book, is that it's a cryptozoological thing. That there's these things are just like gorillas and orangutans and other apes. These things are they're animals, and we can get DNA. We could clone them. This was, I think, one of the interesting things of the so-called possible cover-up of some of these animals, is that the U.S. government, in theory, if they've got some dead Sasquatch or something, that they could be doing all kinds of stuff. They could clone them. They could have their own captive Sasquatch that they've created themselves. And along those lines, you could perhaps, maybe this is where the paranormal aspect comes in, where you have some kind of genetically engineered Sasquatch or something, but they've been trained actually by the military. I mean, it all sounds so fantastic.
The government, knowing about this, involved in genetic engineering of Bigfoot?
Yeah, it sounds incredible. And as I had to speculate about that in my book.
David, didn't Hitler try to, wasn't there some sort of genetics program where they were going to try to create this primitive super warrior, super soldier or something? I seem to remember reading about that some years back. So you think the U.S. government, if potentially they do have genetic material, that they could possibly be attempting to clone these animals or somehow create...
I seem to recall, and maybe you guys know this story too, but isn't there... seems like there's some UFO abduction type story where one of the people claimed that he was in some like UFO base or something, that there was a Bigfoot in a cage or something like that.
No, I think you're referring to the Clearview case outside of the Air Force Academy back in the late 70s, where Air Force officers arrived in a saucer and talked to this particular rancher and his family, and there was a Bigfoot standing nearby holding a box that had blinking lights on it. And
okay, right.
This creature had been seen by the rancher on a couple of occasions prior to this, and the Air Force claimed that he was under their control. And one of the officers had some device on a belt, and he hit a button or a switch, and the Bigfoot kind of twitched and fell down and dropped the box, and then he clicked it back on, and the Bigfoot woke up or something and stood back up holding the blinking box. So go figure. That's one of the weirdest cases
right.
I've heard of.
That's a pretty interesting story. And so there you have maybe some Bigfoot that's got implanted by the military, and they can kind of mind control him with some electronic gear that they've got, in the back of his brain or something. I mean, stories like that seem like some grade B sci-fi movie from the 50s or something, but yet
why would they say something like that, though? Why would they?
Well, right. I mean, exactly, and for people to just somehow make up some utterly bizarre story like that also apparently makes no sense. That's kind of far-fetched too. That people are just going to fabricate that. I often think that there's something to these stories. Not necessarily exactly what the people witnessed, maybe, but something's going on. Even even with stories like that, you can have holographic projections. I believe that the military does do all kinds of unusual psyops and mind control type of operations for their own, strange experiments on people just to see how they'll react and things like that. But I really do not discount the idea that they, and I'm saying the military or, whoever it is exactly, that they could have, the bodies of Bigfoot, actual live Bigfoot, cloned or genetically engineered Bigfoot. If these animals really exist, and I believe they do, and they are animals, there's no reason why the military couldn't have, be doing research on them themselves. They want to know this stuff too. And it's my opinion that many of the things that you guys talk about on the Paracast are within the military and other covert agencies, that even this stuff is well known to them, but they largely keep it a secret.
Okay, so if the U.S. government is doing this, what about other governments? Are they engaged in this kind of trickery?
Well, yeah, they would be in a sense, particularly, say, the Russians. The Chinese government is well known to be interested in the wild men of China. The Russians, in fact, many of the Russian investigators, they're actually part of the government who are doing this, and they're Russian scientists. So the Russians particularly have always had an open mind when it comes to paranormal type things, Bigfoot, UFOs, even psychic phenomenon. And even though the CIA has done psychic experiments and other things like that, when stories get out into the mainstream media, they sort of laugh at it, and it makes the CIA look like a bunch of goofballs doing these sort of strange experiments. But in Russia, it's taken much more seriously and is actually part of the government programs. The whole strange story of the Minnesota Iceman, which I detail in one of the chapters, is really weird. And the more you look into it, the stranger it gets. And at one point, apparently, the Vietnamese government was involved in it, and the military. And the story that has come out about the Minnesota Iceman is that it was from Vietnam, and it was loaded onto a helicopter. It was brought back by the military to the United States. It was in California. It ended up in private hands. It was encased in ice. It was then sent up to Minnesota, where for basically about a year, it was shown at these various county fairs and things in Minnesota and Wisconsin, and then suddenly vanished. But Ivan T. Sanderson and Bernard Hovelmans, had a chance to really look carefully at the Minnesota Iceman at this barn in Minnesota before it vanished, and they concluded that it was a real critter in there and not a fake.
Okay, vanished, David. In what way? They just stopped showing it, or what?
Yeah, what happened to the Minnesota Iceman was it was being exhibited for a while. Ivan T. Sanderson and Hovelmans got to see it and study it. And then the FBI got involved because it had been shot through the eye. And, and in fact, apparently it had been shot by an American soldier or something in Vietnam War. And but then it vanished. And what happened then was a fake was put in its place. And then briefly, this other Iceman was exhibited. People who looked at it could see that it was a fake. It was like a wax dummy inside the ice. But the original Iceman totally disappeared. And it apparently had been owned by a very wealthy person in Los Angeles. But, exactly who he was and how we got the Iceman and where it went, we don't know. And it's possible that the government itself ended up with the Iceman. And if it really was a real body, as Sanderson and Hovelmans believed, then it would be valuable. And certainly the government would want it and perhaps got it, or else it ended up in some private lab where they're studying it. And part of it, what is so important and rarely talked about in other Bigfoot books, is that having DNA of a Sasquatch is important. I mean, you could do a lot with that, particularly with the technology of cloning and stuff that we have today.
It'd be something to be able to try to nail down. So how do we nail it down, David? I mean, we have the story where this disappeared and was replaced by a fake before the exhibit was withdrawn. We have all these reports about the government involvement. How do we nail it down and prove any of this stuff?
Well, make a good FOIA request.
I think people naturally want proof, and good proof, and I'm like that too. Photographs of Bigfoot are good, and that's kind of the main thing we have now, and stories. Getting actual hair and blood samples of some of these critters, whether it's in Bhutan or Sumatra or California or whatever, I mean, that's what we need. When you look at Roger Patterson's famous Bluff Creek movie footage, and that is perhaps, the best known evidence really of Bigfoot that we have, and that's a female too who's walking there, and that's been studied over and over again. There's whole books just about that movie footage.
So maybe now, because we are getting towards the last three segments of the show, Chris, you've accumulated some questions from the Paracast forums. You asked one of them, and maybe we could pepper David with more questions from the forums. Go ahead, please.
Well, actually, David's actually done a good job answering several of the questions. The only one I haven't really asked and pressed David on was the whole telepathic connection that some witnesses have described when they lock eyes with these creatures. I think, what's his name? Kawani, Jack Sapardis, he wrote a book, The Psychic Sasquatch. I'm probably butchering his name. But I seem to remember reading the book years ago, I seem to remember from it that there, in his mind, that there is a fairly intriguing body of evidence that would suggest that these creatures do have some sort of psychic abilities and that some people have been impacted by this. Have you run across this particular element in your research?
Yeah, sure. And in fact, there's a woman in Wisconsin who's written a book or two about Bigfoot. And I think one of them's called Backyard Bigfoot or something like that. And she claims to have had something of a psychic relationship with this Bigfoot who in the winter would come by her remote house in the woods of Wisconsin and leave footprints, and that she had something of a psychic relationship with him. And that's all fine. I feel that people have psychic relationships with all kinds of animals, and that's always fascinating. There's no reason why people couldn't have some psychic connection with Bigfoot too. Bigfoot, in my mind, he's curious about humans, and he's not really a threat. Even though there are stories of Bigfoot attacking people, even people being killed by Bigfoot. In the Himalayas, I can tell you that the whole concept of Yetis, seeing a Yeti, having some encounter, it's a subject that's very uncomfortable to the people there. They don't want to see a Yeti. They feel it's terrible luck. Even to talk about Yetis is bad luck. People are reluctant to really discuss it in great detail. It's a subject that you should avoid, really. And if you've seen a Yeti and encountered one, they believe it means you're going to die. So it's not something you want to have happen to you. That said, people do still encounter Yetis as we get more and more people are modernized and they forget these, say, superstitions in a sense about Yetis, and they will talk about it more, I think. But really, ultimately, what I've concluded is that they're animals. They're super strong. They've got incredibly keen senses. They know to avoid people if they can, but still, they're curious about people. And a lot of the stories that are in my book are of Yeti and Bigfoot Peeping Toms. This is what happened here in Arizona, and where I'm speaking right now. on the White Mountain Apache Reservation in 2005. This family there, they were Apache Indians, they called the police because this peeping Tom was looking in their window and watching them in their bedroom and stuff. And then when the Apache police arrived at these people's cabin, and people do live in remote areas of the forest there, and it's a giant forest, what the police, and it was a woman who saw it, when she arrived, there was this Bigfoot that was there at these people's cabin, and this Bigfoot was skulking around. He was this peeping Tom looking in their window, and the police woman saw him right there in the headlights. And she filed a report. This got in the news here in Arizona, became even national news. And the witnesses in this case were this Apache family, but also this police woman. But also, like in the Dupont Monster case in Illinois, what brought the Bigfoot into the vicinity where people having these close encounters was ultimately sex. And Bigfoot, people were having sex in their cars or in the White Mountain thing in their bedroom, and Bigfoot wanted to see, what he was missing or what was going on.
So not only his hair is kinky then, huh? I couldn't resist.
So I don't know. Well, I mean, I'd be interested to hear what you think about this, Nick. I mean, so many of the British with 40 and times and things like that, and the mystery black cats of England and stuff like that. I mean, do you think that Bigfoot has got the ability to sort of appear and disappear at will?
I've done a lot of research into Bigfoot reports in Britain, and it often surprises people to learn that there's actually a tremendous number of reports. Now, if you go back to the 1400s, they're very much described as like wild men of the woods type stories, in the sense that I won't say they look like human beings, but they look more like a hair-covered human than they do a giant ape. Now, if you sort of go forward to the present day, we actually do get a lot of reports that would fit into like a classic Bigfoot category for Britain. Now, bear in mind, Britain, the whole country of England, Scotland and Wales, is actually, the combined square mileage is smaller than the state of Texas, and yet the population is a full 20% of the entire American population. So in other words, for a small country, Britain's heavily populated. And one of the problems with Bigfoot in Britain is you could argue that it's seen too frequently. And for creatures that are described as being sort of 7 foot tall in the British Isles, we would have to see colonies of these creatures, but we only ever see them solitary. And we don't see evidence of what would have to be massive feeding activity to sustain a 7 foot tall, 400 pound creature on a daily basis. And that's one of the problems in Britain. And we also get a lot of reports of Bigfoot just vanishing from sight in Britain or haunting places like old bridges, crossroads, which is something you typically see in countless paranormal type stories. So, whereas I think there's a good argument for saying things like the Yeti and the orang pendek of Sumatra are flesh and blood animals, I'm less inclined to think that's the case in Britain. I think Bigfoot in Britain is not just weird. Bigfoot in Britain is like too weird.
Well, I agree with you there that, Bigfoot in Britain seems to be quite an anomaly. And I've heard, there are some stories of Bigfoot. There's kind of one area, where is that, where people sort of see it, but in my mind, there's not really, some large amount of stories of Bigfoot in the UK. That would be surprising to me.
Yeah, I actually wrote a book on this called Man Monkey, which was a study of a famous case in central England, which the reports kicked off in the late 1800s and continue to this day at this one particular bridge which runs over a canal, a large bridge that runs over a canal in England. There have been countless sightings there of this weird creature with glowing silvery eyes, and it has more of like a paranormal phantom aspect to it than it does anything flesh and blood.
Ladies and gentlemen, I will not comment on the rather lame effort of our co-hosts in the previous section to vocalize the Paracast, because if I were to do it, it would be worse. And we're not going to ask David. By the way, David, that's a new thing with guests now. You have to vocalize on the air.
Yeah, you got to sing, David.
Let me try it. Paracast.
There you go.
All right, we'll record that and sell it and keep the profits. David Hatcher Childress is author of Yetis, Sasquatch, and Hairy Giants. The co-hosts are Chris O'Brien and Nicholas Redfern. I'm Gene Steinberg. You're in the Paracast. Since we got into that touchy subject of paranormal Bigfoot, so that takes us back to this other kind of creature, the Mothman. Is the Mothman some kind of winged Bigfoot, David?
You know, that's interesting. And one of the old issues of our magazine, which is called World Explorer, one of the articles was about bat squatch, which was also out of Washington State, a kind of Mothman type story of a winged Bigfoot kind of guy who had, say, the Mothman characteristics as well as that of Bigfoot.
And he had pointed ears, too.
Yeah, pointed ears and things. Bat squatch is what the newspapers, called him.
Well, if he has pointed ears, he's actually Spock Squatch.
Yeah. Sasquatch, yeah, that's right. The whole concept of flying humanoids and winged people, Mothmen, people, humanoids flying, giant bats for that matter. I mean, that was a fascinating subject and one that deserves its own book. With stuff like that is pretty paranormal, I would say. And so once you do cross the line from, gorillas and orangutans and hairy ape men in Sumatra or the Himalayas or even the United States, when you get these flying critters, Mothman type of stuff, you're really looking, I think, at something that is totally paranormal. And it's interesting to think with Mothman, too, he's often said to be this harbinger of death, like a Yeti. And what I was just talking about earlier, how in the Himalayas it's very, very bad luck to see a Yeti, and it means you're going to die. And that's kind of the same thing with Mothman, too, that, you see Mothman and something bad's going to happen to you kind of thing. So, and a lot of people think that with other things, black cats, crossing your path, maybe something strange peering in your window at night, and it's a bad omen, shall we say.
Nick, what is your point of view about all this? You were briefly telling us about that particular case with the creature with the glowing eyes in the UK.
My personal opinion, having sort of investigated all these weird creatures over the years, I think two things are going on. One, I think some of them are definitely flesh and blood animals that science hasn't recognized or categorized yet. But I think others are paranormal. But of course, that depends how we define what the paranormal might be. Is it something truly supernatural, or is it an aspect of science that we don't necessarily fully understand yet, and that we call it paranormal because that's the only way we can describe it. But I think what does happen sometimes is that there's a tendency when we're investigating strange creatures that for many researchers it's an either-or thing. You're either classed as the researcher who believes these are paranormal, or you're the nuts and bolts flesh and blood guy. And I think that's a mistake. I think sort of a fatal mistake. In reality, I think, as I said, there's several things going on. And just because Bigfoot's, or the Yeti in the Himalayas appears to be a very definite flesh and blood animal, and I would say that again for the Orang Pendek in Sumatra, the fact that we also get paranormal qualities for some cases, I don't think destroys the scenario or the other scenario. What I actually suspect it does is suggest to us that there's several things going on. And as researchers, we should treat them as separate things, not try and force feed them, if you like, into one category and leave out the bits of the stories that we don't like or whatever, which some researchers unfortunately do.
Isn't that, of course, part of the problem in trying to nail this down, which is, of course, one of the difficult things, and certainly people who are skeptical about the possibility of a Bigfoot or this hairy creature, whether it's paranormal or physical or there's a combination of both, is performing the kinds of investigations we need to take it out of anecdotal evidence and bring it into mainstream science. So whoever wants to pick up this, okay, how do we get mainstream science to take any of this seriously?
I don't know. Someone's got to get a 30-06 and bring one down, I think, and have the whole post-mortem process documented. One thing I would suggest to people who are thinking about going out and renting a gorilla costume and running around the woods where they know there's trail cams, I would be very careful. I'll bet you there's some good old boys out there that would just love to bring one down just to kind of get their 15 minutes of fame and probably a lot of money for this. I think David brought up a really good point about trail cams and the proliferation of cell cams. Obviously, the handy cam recorders have come down in price. I think we're going to see more and more visual evidence of these things, and hopefully real good quality evidence that would give enough data, I think, for an optical examination by science to determine, obviously, if it's a hoax or real, and if it is real, start the process of determining what we're dealing with here scientifically. I know a lot of people on the forum absolutely don't buy into the whole concept of crypto creatures such as Bigfoot running around. I think David brought up a really good point about the proliferation, or whatever that word is. Everybody's got a cell cam. Yeah, everybody's got a cell cam now. The handy cams have come way down in price. I think we're going to see more and more visual evidence. This obviously would be a place for science to get involved, to analyze some of these videos, determine if they're real, and if they are real, what we're dealing with. Obviously, bringing one down, finding the remains of one, having physical evidence would be the holy grail in this scenario. But I think that's where it's got to start. It's almost like you have to prove that something is, you have to disprove a negative in order to get science involved, just like in UFOs, just like in hauntings, in other subjects that science tends to hold its nose around. But that would be, I think, the most logical place where this whole thing is going scientifically.
Well, I agree with you there that, what I predict is going to happen is there's going to be more and more and more photos of Bigfoot, video footage of Bigfoot. YouTube is going to have more and more quickie videos of Bigfoot. Some of these videos are fascinating. Some are just jokes or hoaxes. But we're going to see more and more of that. And it's because cameras are ubiquitous. And the same thing's kind of happening with UFOs, too. More and more people are carrying cameras and video footage, and therefore we'll get more good footage, daylight footage and stuff of UFOs. The idea that we're going to actually get a live Bigfoot on TV or something like that, and that some press conference is going to occur like last year, which was a total hoax, but where someone says, yeah, here's the dead Bigfoot, we've got it. Hopefully something like that will happen one day. It's kind of sad, and this is a controversial part of the whole Bigfoot stories is it okay to go out and shoot a Bigfoot? Is that murder? And that's just, there's already people who are campaigning against that. Bigfoot needs to be saved. We shouldn't have people running around with guns looking for Bigfoot. And even that would be a strange sort of thing that might happen in the future, where suddenly Bigfoot is a protected animal, and the government has to declare him, as protected. No one is allowed to shoot Bigfoot. Something like that. That right there would be tantamount to the government admitting that, yeah, these creatures are out there. And I think that's a big step for them. And it's what I've kind of gathered talking to people, and the encounters that they claim they've had with rangers and stuff, where rangers have basically acknowledged to them that, yes, we know these animals are out there. Yes, we want to leave them be. Please don't go, hunting Bigfoot during hunting season or something like that. And I think it is hunters who do encounter Bigfoot. And a number of stories are people have weapons with them, and they actually could shoot and kill a Bigfoot. But when the time comes, they can't do it.
Okay, so do we regard, therefore, David, as these creatures as being endangered species? Is that a reason why maybe forest rangers, et cetera, would say, don't go there because they want to protect this? What's the story?
Right. I've kind of come to the conclusion that within the ranger community, there is something of an unwritten code of not hunting Bigfoot, not disturbing him, leaving him alone, giving him his territory, letting him, do his thing. And the idea that Bigfoot hunters are out there with guns trying to kill Bigfoot, they don't like that idea. It really does come down to this crux of the matter. Is Bigfoot some type of humanoid? Is he really more human than animal? Or, is shooting a Bigfoot, the same as shooting a chimpanzee or some other ape? And part of the problem here is that Bigfoot is very human. He is like a missing link, really. And it's interesting too that except for the Gigantopus fossils that have been found in China, and they know that this giant ape did live once, and perhaps he is the Yeti and the Almas of Mongolia, but yeah, where is that missing link fossil? Well, one of the things is, and we were talking about this earlier, about why don't people just find Bigfoot dead on the trail or something, and it's the same reason why you don't see a dead bear on the trail while you're hiking. And things don't become fossils. If a bear suddenly dies of old age in the wood, he's not going to become a fossil. If you shoot a deer and just leave him in the woods, he won't become a fossil either. So the idea that Bigfoot is out there and that he is some kind of missing link that between humans and the apes, yeah, I mean, he can be there without us really finding a fossil record necessarily, because fossils are largely created through cataclysms and anomalies. Things, whether they're dinosaurs or whatever, they have to be buried under tons of gravel and ash and in an airless environment, and then they create fossils. That's not what happens to most animals when they die.
Is there possibly, because they're more intelligent creatures, a Bigfoot burial ground? I'm not being silly. This is a question.
Yeah, no, right. No, exactly. And I mean, that's it. They are intelligent that way, and they are partly human, I believe, in the sense that they do things like a human. They have sort of families. They would maybe bury the dead and have some. I don't think there's some big Bigfoot burial ground up in Washington that all the Bigfoot go to, but within their tribe, as you might call it, yeah, they would bury the dead if something happened. Even have their own weird Bigfoot funeral. I don't know, but yeah, in those ways they would act more like humans rather than just complete animals. They really are partly human. They have intelligence. They want to know. They're very curious. And from what I've gathered with Bigfoot stories, Bigfoot wants to know what we're doing. He's afraid of us. He doesn't want to really come into the cities and stuff. He knows that that's not his place. But people who live in remote forested areas, yeah, it's quite possible that they'll be visited by Bigfoot, and Bigfoot's curious about them. He wants to know what they're doing.